Yeah, I'm a tax director here at Parry. I'm going to talk about some of the budget announcements. I know Martin's kind of covered a few of them earlier, but there wasn't actually a huge amount to talk about after all the excitement last autumn. Us tax geeks here got quite excited about all the different changes and the U-turns, and then obviously we had the final budget in December. Obviously, the budget last week was probably always going to be a bit boring for us, but there was a couple of big headlines there. I'd say one surprise, really not in my area, but I will kind of touch on it. So the pink boxes here are for companies, and the ones in black writing I'll just do a bit more on. So just to cover the company ones, we've got the corporation tax rate of 25% was finally confirmed, although we kind of knew that was going to happen. Any profits below 50k will be taxed at 19%, and then we've got a lovely little hybrid rate between profits of 250k and 50k, where it will be somewhere between 25% and 19%. So Chris has just covered some of the R&D changes, and then one of the other ones was the 12 investment zones that are going to be launched. One of them is actually in the West Midlands, which is kind of where I'm from these days. So you'll have some really nice tax breaks on stamp duty, capital allowances, national insurance. Don't know too much about it at the moment, but they've just announced that they're going to have these investment zones. And then I was scratching around at the seams just to be able to fill this slide. One of them as well was they're going to actually be simplifying some of the EMI administration, which is quite useful for OMBs, and it's going to be more of an annual process now rather than if you start a new EMI scheme, you've got to notify them within 92 days, which was a bit of a random number. But now it's going to be at the same time as any ERS returns and EMI notifications. So that's just a bit of simplification and another date for us to not have to remember. Some of the other ones on the more personal side, obviously Martin covered the childcare costs, which will be sort of beneficial for, I suppose, both corporates and sort of individuals, but they're coming in on a phased approach through to 2025 while they build up the labour in the childcare market. The pension reform I'm going to cover a little bit on, and then obviously for everybody, the energy price guarantee extension through to the 30th of June is a bit of benefit for everyone. So yeah. So capital allowances, on my side, this was the most exciting part. They obviously announced the full expensing of capital allowances, that's brand new plant and machinery. Anything that falls into the special rate pools, so things like electrical items, water systems, that will fall into a new 50% pool. But as is always the case with tax, the devil is in the detail. When these assets are disposed of, there's now going to be a tax charge. Under the old rules, there were no tax charges, unless it was an exceptional situation. They've announced that the AIA is continuing for up to £1 million. So you may ask, well, why are we getting full expensing and AIA? It's a good question. We still haven't got all the details on that. Our understanding is that we can hopefully still prioritise the AIA. But definitely for second-hand assets that you acquire, assets that you acquire to lease out, they will only fall into the AIA. And also any unincorporated businesses will only get AIA. They won't get the full expensing. So we say that the government are trying to simplify the tax legislation. I'm just going to cover a little bit here of the recent changes on capital allowances, which basically shows you that the government are far from simplifying capital allowances. Just to kind of do a whistle-stop tour, annual investment allowance was introduced in 2008 at a limit of £50,000. Since then, it's moved 7 times, and the rate has been anything between 25,000 and £1 million. Then the annual writing down allowances for main pool and special rate pools, they've all changed 3 times over the years. And then finally, structures and buildings allowance was were introduced in 2018, which was a very, very slow replacement to industrial building allowances, for those that remember it, in the early days. So, on to the more recent stuff. Obviously, they introduced the super deduction in 2021, which was a 2-year relief, where you got 130% relief in the year of acquisition of new plant and machinery. Again, this was the first time where sort of general plant and machinery resulted in a tax charge on disposal. The super deduction has been replaced by the full expensing at 100% relief. Again, you get a tax charge on disposal based on the proceeds that brought into account. So if you scrap an asset, that's okay. So how does that tie up the super deduction versus the full expensing? So the super deduction, if you spend £100,000 worth of on new plant and machinery that qualifies for super deduction, that in cash terms is £24,700 per £100,000 to spend. The full expensing, now that the corporation tax rate has increased to 25%, or about to, I should say, that means that for every £100,000 of spend, you'll get £25,000 worth of relief. So that's actually a £300 real cash difference per £100,000 of expenditure on new plant and machinery. So actually, it's about there or thereabouts. So if you're thinking, do I need to push any expenditure forward into this tax year? Is it really worth it? It's £300 per £100,000 of expenditure. So it might bring some cash savings forward a little bit in cash, but overall it's there or thereabouts. So that's why they've done the full expensing and retained the corporation tax rate at 25%. What does this mean for us as tax advisors? Well, unfortunately, because the super deduction and the full expensing involves tax charges on disposal, that means we've got to keep better record keeping. When it was all just put into a pool and disposed of and there were no tax charges, all we needed was the carried forward balance, and we didn't really care about what date an asset was acquired, what rate it was tax relief was claimed at. Now we've got to track every single asset, the date it was acquired, what relief was claimed, what rate of relief it was claimed under, and then we've got to calculate potentially a tax charge on disposal. So if they're thinking that this is simplifying the tax legislation, that's far from the truth. And obviously as well, this is only potentially at the moment for 3 years. So what happens at the end of that 3 years? What happens when there's a change in government? So yeah, effectively a lot better record keeping will be required for every single asset where potentially a tax charge may arise. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news on that one when it was all supposed to be positive news. So on to the more positive stuff, pension reform. I know Martin covered it briefly. They've increased the annual allowance from 40,000 up to 60,000, but I understand that's still going to be tapered. And the one big surprise from the budget last week was that the lifetime allowance has been now completely abolished. But again, watch this space. Who knows what's going to happen when there's going to be a change of government. Another thing that was sort of hidden away in the small print was the energy bill discount scheme for corporates is continuing for another year. That's for sort of any fixed price contract, any sort of new contracts that are going to be agreed. And yeah, it's basically just a continuation of the other scheme for another year, which I suppose is good news. And then there wasn't really much else to talk about. So these are just a few of the headlines that was just captured within the small print of the press release. I suppose I say it was a headline in the small print, but one obvious omission was capital gains tax. Capital gains tax still is at the same rates. We've had lots of speculation for years and years and years that those rates are going to change. They still haven't changed. So if you qualify for business asset disposal relief, the rates are 10%. The main rate of capital gains tax is remaining at 20% for the next year. Watch this space beyond that. As Chris mentioned, there's ongoing R&D changes. A few other things just to sort of pick out were the plastic packaging tax rate is going to increase slightly. And then the rest of it is all about sort of simplifying systems. I mean, if they're on about simplifying systems like they have done with cap allowances, then, well, watch this space. But unfortunately, there isn't really that much more for me to talk about from the budget, because it was a little bit light on the headlines this time around. So